Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking about the Romantic movement today. This was a movement in art, literature, culture, just really touched many fields. Starting in the mid 1700s in Germany. Well, it wasn't Germany at that time, what would later become Germany. And then continuing on through into the 1800s and really with many lasting effects even to this day. So we'll be talking about what it is and what it influenced, and of course, particularly talking about its impact on British literature. So here on this initial slide, I'll point out a few of the pictures that I have. One of them is a bit obscured by the little video in the corner, but I'll point out the others. So this first individual right here, that is the Polish-French composer Frédéric Chopin. I probably mispronounced his name, but you know what I mean. And so that kind of shows the impact of Romanticism in music. Right here, this is a poet, John Keats, wrote some very polished and very beautiful poems that we still read to this day, and died at a very young age from tuberculosis. This right here is another poet by the name of Lord Byron, and kind of a scandalous fellow who kind of lived the original sex, drugs, and rock and roll sort of life, and was kind of considered the first international celebrity in many ways, and also died at a pretty young age. Right here is a depiction of the French Revolution, which is one of the big influences on the Romantic movement throughout, and had a large impact on a lot of what they talked about. This here is kind of a depiction of both sort of the celebration of the extremes and passions that you see in Romanticism, as well as a depiction of how important nature is in Romanticism. So this particular painting seen as among many others, as a good example of Romanticism in the visual arts. All right, so we're going to go and move on to the next slide now. Okay, so quick overview. When are we talking about? So in British literature, we're talking about 1780s through 1830s. As I mentioned on the first slide, Romanticism really began in many ways in what would later become Germany. A little bit before that, say in the earlier, a little earlier in the 1700s. And some parts of the world it lasted much longer than this. For example, American Romanticism is generally thought to be from, say, the 1840s to the Civil War. So a little bit after British Romanticism in literature. Where was it? Well, most of the westernized world, which keep in mind this is at a time when Europe is colonizing the rest of the world. So that ends up being an impact on kind of the whole world in many ways. Yeah. What does it affect? As I mentioned on the first slide, you see its impact in literature and music, in philosophy, both as initial influences on the movement and then its influence later on. In the visual arts and even in the sciences, you see the influence of some ideas of the Romantic movement. So it's very broad spanning, and it was a big movement that had a lot of parts to it and a lot of impact. So a little bit of background. So before the Romantic movement, we have the era kind of known in Europe and what's kind of the westernized world as the Enlightenment era. We've already talked about that. We talked about that some towards the end of last semester. So if you'll recall, some elements of the Enlightenment that were really important were reason and order were very highly prized. It was all about regularity, classical models, this sort of thing. Maintaining social order and avoiding chaos is very important. And they thought we would do that by seeing things as well-reasoned and seeing society kind of as a well-tuned machine, which we sort of need to shape everybody to fit into it like nice little cogs. The city and civilization were very important. So most of the prominent British writers at this time tended to either live in or spend a lot of time in London and other cities, and literature was seen as a very sociable phenomenon, instead of, kind of your lone poet scribbling away in a closet. It was more, these are, cosmopolitan people who are meeting together in coffee houses and swapping stuff, and, it's very socially engaged. The country and uncivilized behavior are seen as kind of lesser and inferior in many ways. Artificial, interestingly enough, is in many ways preferred to natural. I mean, you just think of pictures you see of people in the Enlightenment, and what are a lot of them wearing? They're wearing wigs, because artificial hair is better than natural hair, because it's more regular. You have the poet Alexander Pope, who wrote a poem he talked about last semester, and they said that he was so obsessed with everything being regular and in order and everything, that he would dig up trees on his property to have them replanted in straight lines. So that kind of thing. Government is by the aristocracy and for the aristocracy. Now, who the aristocracy is has in many ways expanded. So in a lot of places, for example, in the UK and Britain, the aristocracy, kind of the old aristocracy that's landed, and then the new aristocracy that is more from merchants and people like that who've made their money through business. And both these are very much seen as an aristocracy and an upper class, and they run the show. So it's not a whole lot of the lower class doing stuff and such. And we see the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. I'll also mention stuff like, the scientific revolution are really getting going during this time and such as well. So, all right. So, of course, there are some problems with the Enlightenment. Okay. So first and foremost, the Enlightenment tended to treat people as machines. Well, it tended to treat kind of everything in the world, if you will, as a machine. So, this is the way they look at the cosmos, is this big, well-ordered machine. Trees and animals are just, machines of all these different little parts working together. That was sort of their model of everything in many ways was the machine. Even God was seen as kind of the perfect watchmaker who made the perfect machine that runs really nice. But people aren't just machines. And thinking of people as machines, well, first of all, it can be very dehumanizing. And it really ties into the way the Enlightenment tended to see psychology. They tended to take John Locke's idea that people were basically blank slates, that you condition them right and you program them right, and they can be easily shaped into nice little cogs in your machine. Now, there's some time, conditioning and, well, what we're doing right now, education, do definitely have an impact on people, but we're not blank slates, and we're not all the same sort of blank slate or blank sheet of paper to be programmed in every which way. There's inborn differences, and there's things within humans that really resist being shaped in that way. So it's not the view of psychology that they propounded just didn't really work in the long term. And order at all costs really tends to marginalize a lot of people. So, you think about it over time, say your great-granddaddy ran afoul of the system, you're a lot less likely to trust the system because of, what happened to him. And over time, that sort of mounts up and resistance builds up. There's also the rising power of middle and lower classes at the time, which was in many ways upsetting the apple cart. I already said that there was an aristocracy of not only of the old landed aristocracy, but a new aristocracy of the merchant class and such. Well, that gets expanded even more and more during this time period, and more people are starting to make money and rise in power and influence, and so it starts upsetting a lot of the old expectations and such. And in the Enlightenment, there was a couple different models of government they had. One was what we see sort of in, the American Revolution and forming the Constitution, the idea of balanced powers and checks and checks and balances and stuff like that. But probably more common at the time was the idea of the enlightened despot. So that was, we'll have this absolute monarch, which, a lot of nations in the world and in Europe at this time had absolute monarchs already. But the difference is they'll be enlightened. They'll be really, really wise and well educated, so they'll govern well and basically be the perfect people to run the machine. And the best example of this enlightened despot in many ways, considered to be, to use all these new ideas of psychology and human organization, everything, was this fellow by the name of Frederick the Great. And what he used all this newfound power and enlightened despotism to do was basically turn his entire country into a recruitment center for producing the most powerful military possible and then going and trying to conquer everybody else. And obviously that led to some problems. And I mean, there's also just this simple human desire for just the dramatic and the exotic. And, wanting things that aren't just kind of the well-run machine and the orderly everything, and, just kind of this desire for something that breaks the norm. And I think that had an impact as well. Okay, so what is Romanticism? This Romanticism that we're talking about. Well, there's a lot of facets to it, and it's a little bit hard to define because one of the elements of Romanticism is that it doesn't like definition. Okay, prefers to kind of feel things out rather than rigid and logical definitions. So naturally, it's hard to define. But here's some important elements. One is emotion, or as they said it a lot of times, sensibility, is often prized over logic or reason. So think of Qui-Gon Jinn's advice to young Anakin here.
Remember, concentrate on the moment. Feel, don't think. Use your instincts.
I will.
Yeah, Qui-Gon is really encapsulating an important element of that, kind of like follow your instincts. You know what you should do in your heart, all this kind of stuff. This advice that we get, yeah, that's straight out of the Romantic era. Nature and the natural is often preferred to man-made or artificial. So once again, we see, the wigs go out of fashion and long flowing locks of hair become popular. The lone individual over society, instead of prizing the society and with all its intricacy and well built and running like a nice little well-tuned machine, it's more the lone individual that's kind of at war with and doesn't really get along with society, is more what we see popularized in the Romantic movement. The extremes of human experience are emphasized. So a lot of the Romantic heroes, instead of being kind of these well-balanced, even-tempered sort of fellows, have very violent swings of emotion. Those of you who read Wuthering Heights, I mean, that's a quintessentially romantic novel right there. In not just in the sense we use romantic today, but in the sense of it being a good example of the Romantic movement. And that really ties into this idea of the Byronic hero, which we'll get into a little bit later and kind of mention it right here. The idea of the natural genius or self-made man that's, just basically owes nothing to their surroundings except for this powerful force within them that sort of leads them to greatness, almost in this preordained sort of way, and as some sort of unstoppable force is really important. All right, so all of that really shows up when we're talking Romanticism. Okay. So by now you might be thinking, this sounds a little
the flowers gone, long time passing.
Remind you of any other eras in history? Yes, in many ways. The whole hippie countercultural movement of the 1960s and so was just redoing Romanticism. The hippies weren't as nearly as original as they thought they were. I mean, really, you look at the Romantic poets and others of the sort, the weird hairstyles, the odd, flashy clothing, the let's say non-traditional forms of relationship being celebrated, the use of mind-altering substances, the celebration of nature. I mean, all of it is straight out of the Romantic playbook. So, yeah. So you can kind of think of the Romantics as late 1700 and early 1800 hippies in many ways. You wouldn't be too far off. All right, so some major ideas of Romanticism, and a really central one is this idea of organicism. Instead of seeing the human as a machine, it tends to instead see the human as implicated and part of nature. And nature is not seen as this intricate machine, but rather as kind of this undefinable, living, breathing force of life, if you will. So, and it really shows how the human is sort of implicated in nature, as, you know, it celebrates how the human is part of nature. And you also have at this time, keep in mind that Romanticism is right around the time, starts right around the time when the Industrial Revolution is getting going in a major way. And so you have a lot of things like, you know, people living in factories and tenements and not really being out in nature that much. So you start to see appreciation of nature as this thing you go visit, which probably previous you know, generations didn't have as much of, because everywhere they were was nature. You know, they just went for a nature walk whenever they walked outside. But around this time, you have people that lived kind of divorced from a lot of elements of the natural world on a regular basis, and so it's become seen as this sort of important thing, sort of separate, that they can think of and talk about and appreciate. And there's also this real deep-seated distrust of the new industrial civilization that's going on. William Blake, an important Romantic poet, talks about factories in this very dark and, you know, kind of, he calls them, you know, basically demonic, and stuff like that. Demonic mills, I think, is what he says. And oh no, satanic mills is what he calls them. And it's just this sense that, you know, this stuff is wrong, it's a violation. So you see a lot of the roots of the modern environmental movement really start with Romanticism in many ways. And there's this belief overall that there's these kind of strong, powerful, and kind of thoughtless forces that push people and whole societies along to these sort of almost inborn and instinctive destinies. And that's a really important element, although, like a lot of other things, it's a little hard to define exactly what's meant by that. Another important idea of Romanticism, as already mentioned, is individualism. So it's belief that the individual rather than the society is really the ultimate decider of what's true and right. In other words, you could be absolutely right and be at war with the rest of society. Whereas I'm not saying that in the Enlightenment period they didn't have any idea of that, and they didn't have individuals that sometimes exemplified that, but it was much more the sense of, you know, society's morals and society's ideals are really important to follow. Whereas Romanticism tended to favor these lone individuals who are at war with society and follow their own rules. And it's this belief that individuals often are more different than they are similar. Now, of course, both are true. People can be very different from each other, but there's also some basic similarities that tie most people together. Well, some, which tie all of us together, really. And so it's not that necessarily that there's not both elements, and it's not that both the Romantics and the Enlightenment before them didn't recognize that. It was more a change of emphasis, where the Romantics tended to emphasize the different and the odd. They tended to have writers like Edgar Allan Poe who would write from a narrative point of view of a crazy person who literally kills an old man because he thinks his eyeball looks weird and stuff like that. As opposed to the Enlightenment, which tended to emphasize more the regularities and the, you know, things shared by everyone in some ways. And I've mentioned this briefly before, but this idea of the Byronic hero becomes a really important element. The Byronic hero is this character that's, like I said, he's this lone. And I say he. There are women in literature who exemplify that too, but it is more commonly a male figure that sort of exemplifies this type of individual. The Byronic hero is named after Lord Byron, the guy I mentioned on that first slide who's lived a kind of scandalous life, burned the candle at both ends, and randomly runs off to Greece to help them fight their war of independence, and dies in his early 30s. But Byron tended to, both in his way he lived his life and also in his literature, popularize this figure that was kind of mysterious and a little dangerous and at war with society and deeply passionate, but followed a code, followed his own code, but his code didn't really get along with other people. And so in many ways, one of the best examples of that is Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. Although in many cases, the romantic hero is a bit more positively drawn than Heathcliff. Another good example, if you've read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte's sister, the sister Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, and Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, and Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre is another really good example of the Byronic hero. More contemporary literature, or movies and such, Batman is actually a pretty good example of many elements of the Byronic hero and all. So, kind of he's active at night instead of during the day like most people. He operates outside the law, but he has his own very strict code that he follows. And he's strangely attractive, but also kind of dangerous and scary and that sort of thing. So, yeah. All right, so some precursors to the Romantic movement. Rousseau. But not that one. This guy. There's a little reference if you're familiar with the TV show Lost. There's a character in there named Rousseau, and that was a picture of her. Anyway, so this guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosophe or philosopher, he's very influential in later movements of society, probably the single most influential philosopher on the Romantic movement. And some important ideas in his philosophy are as follows. Institutions corrupt natural and innate goodness. He believed that people are born naturally good, but these evil institutions conspire to corrupt and warp people from their naturally good behavior. He also believed in this idea of the quote-unquote noble savage. In other words, that apart from society and culture, when people are just left to live by themselves in nature, they're naturally noble and good. And you see some of that in some of the, kind of stereotypical depictions of, say, Native Americans in literature of the time, where they're depicted either as savages who are scary and evil, or as evil savages, or as noble savages who are, close to nature and just naturally good. You see a lot of that in, say, like the Last of the Mohicans and other literature that was really popular around this time. Anyway, and also this idea of kind of finding yourself, that the way to truly become what you should is just to look deep inside and follow the deepest desires of your heart, and they'll naturally lead you to this innate goodness and all. And also the individual rather than the group. I mean, he does talk about groups and the importance of groups a lot, but he really emphasizes this, kind of the instincts and nature of the individual and all. So a lot of this stuff is really important from Rousseau. If you remember, I think most of you read the book Lord of the Flies in your freshman year. Lord of the Flies was a direct criticism of Rousseau. Basically, you got a bunch of noble savages all by themselves on an island, and it turns out that they're not very noble. So yeah, so that's kind of actually a direct criticism of Rousseau's philosophy. Another important precursor was the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He was one of the most influential philosophers ever, not just on the Romantic movement, but he had a big impact there too. I don't claim to know, to be able to understand his philosophy all that well. I've certainly not read much directly by him, but I've gathered this from reading some things about him. So his book, his best-known book, is called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's famously one of the most difficult books ever written to understand, as I've been told. But he talks somewhat about the limits of reason and just the way the mind shapes reality. And he mentions how really we have two worlds. We have the interior world within our own mind, and then the exterior world of stuff outside of us. But the thing is that we only know as much of the exterior world as our mind kind of lets in. So as it impacts our interior world. So we don't really know, as a result, as he says, the thing in itself. We can't know, for example, what a table really is. All we can know is we feel resistance against it when we put our hand on it. We see reflection of certain light waves from this thing we call table, and we interact with it, but we only know in as much of it as we can kind of interact in as much as it impacts us. So ultimately, all our knowledge is based on our own perspective, and it's not knowledge of the thing itself objectively, but more knowledge of whatever happens to impact our subjective internal understanding. And he also believed that we had what was known as a priori knowledge, or in other words, kind of like inbuilt knowledge, really conflicts with that Enlightenment idea of, we're all blank slates that get programmed by society. He thought that we were kind of pre-programmed, if you will, from birth with certain innate understandings and knowledge that we come to sort of unfold and become our starting point from looking at the world. Anyway, so you can see how that idea of this subjective viewpoint being really dominant influences Romanticism. If all we know is, what's filtered through our subjective sense, then, then you can see why people would really celebrate this sort of subjective individualistic perspective and stuff. Okay, and then there's Goethe. And I'm not good at pronouncing German words, so I probably mispronounced his name as well. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He was, as you can see from the dates that he lived, right in the middle of what was known as the Romantic movement. Early on, he was part of the Sturm und Drang movement in Germany, which was a movement in literature that is considered kind of one of the most important precursors to the Romantic movement. I think Sturm und Drang means something like storm and stress. I don't know German, that's just what I've been told. And it emphasized kind of the extremes of emotion and strong contrasts and things like that. He actually individually was a little bit ambivalent about the Romantic movement that he sees going on during his time, even though he is one of the main influences on it. And sort of backed away from some of what he saw as some of the excesses of Romanticism. That being said, like I said earlier, he's one of the most important influences on the movement. Some ideas that are very central in his works is the idea of the creative energy of nature. As nature is kind of this instinctive, powerful force that flows through individuals and is kind of seen as not as a machine, but more as kind of like a living reality and instinctual and all that kind of stuff. And this idea of these internal drives that move people along. And early on in his career, he writes a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther, of this young man who is torn apart by his passion for a woman who's already married and ends up committing suicide. It becomes a smash hit, like one of the first international bestsellers in literature. And in fact, there was apparently copycat suicides from people who read the book. And the publication of The Sorrows of Young Werther is considered to be, if you're going to point to one event that really kicks off the Romantic movement in literature, that was it. So it's like everybody just was taken by it and starts kind of moving in that direction in many cases. Another really important influence is the French Revolution, which, as you looked at the time period, yep, right during that time period. Most of the Romantics were very supportive of the French Revolution, at least in its early stages, because they saw it as kind of like this flowering of the human spirit, throwing off the shackles of outmoded and artificial convention and society. And some of them kind of cooled on it when the French Revolution got really radical and started, turned in the Reign of Terror and stuff like that later on. So, for example, in English literature, Wordsworth and Coleridge supported the revolution early on, but they backed away from it when it got really radical. But then you had some others like Shelley and Byron who were still pretty supportive when there's blood running in the streets and heads falling and stuff like that. I'm not saying that they directly witnessed that. They were actually born they born and came to maturity after that point. But looking back on it, they were more in favor of the kind of dramatic elements there, if you will. And then, but either way, the French Revolution was a very important influence on a lot of the Romantic movement. And you could see it in some ways as a political outflow of the movement, and in other ways as the movement itself as sort of a artistic outflow of the political movement of the French Revolution and similar stuff. Anyway, so that was very influential. And then, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. He is seen as the ultimate expression of the romantic individual, the guy who rises from, his family were minor nobles in Corsica, but that's kind of like saying his parents were really important people in the town of Comfort. Okay, it's kind of a backwater, not very important area, so he didn't come from a, background that seemed likely to produce great leaders, and yet through the sheer force of his genius and the historical moment, he rises to the top and conquers most of Europe. And so it's seen as kind of this triumph of the individual human spirit. And a lot of the Romantics really disliked him personally, even while they're kind of strangely admiring of him. So kind of like the Byronic hero, off-putting but strangely attractive. And he also inspires nationalism and a lot of the other stuff that comes out of the Romantic movement. Because yes, the Romantic movement had some really dark elements too. In their own way, both communism and Nazism are very much direct fruits of the Romantic movement. Both of them, communism seeing it as kind of this natural destiny of the human to reach this utopia where there are no classes and no struggles, and shuck off all these old feudal outmoded stuff like capitalism, and obviously we know how well that didn't go. Nazism as seen as like this inbuilt stuff within some particular race that kind of rises to dominance because it's all innately superior. Yeah, we know how that went too. So there's some real dark sides to a lot of Romanticism, but it's hard to ignore a lot of elements of Romanticism that are hugely influential to this day. And like I said, movements as disparate as like the hippie counterculture movement in the 1960s, and a lot of the scientific, in many ways, Darwin's theory is seen as an outgrowth of some elements of Romanticism in science. You have, stuff like the modern environmentalist movement are in many ways outgrowths of Romanticism, and a lot of what's gone on in art and literature and music ever since then has been strongly influenced by the movement. All right, well, that's that, and we will wrap it up for today. See you guys again in class.